I have to confess that I grew up right here. I grew up in Saratoga and San Jose, and my grandparents grew up or lived in Cupertino on Orange Tree Lane. And in the entire time that I was a kid growing up here, I never knew the name of the tribe who is ancestral to this space. And I realized that I didn't know the name of the tribe when I was about 18 or 19 years old, and I took my first community college course at Kenyatta College. And I asked the professor in the history class, well, are we going to learn about the native history of this area? And he said, no. No, if you want to learn about that, you can take a class from that guy over there. And he looked at, and going by the back of the class was this guy named Eldon Earnhardt, who was, he's an archaeologist. What I learned pretty quickly is that the telling of the story of California natives is not done very well. As a matter of fact, it's done very poorly. And the fact that it's been done so poorly has led to disastrous consequences for Native people in California. If you look at a map of the state of California, look at contemporary tribal lands, you'll see the entire area of the Central Coast section completely devoid of reservation lands or rancherias. I went to graduate school like so many people here. Lee went to graduate school to UC Berkeley, and we probably wanted to do the same thing, learn about the history of California Native people to tell this story. And what we kind of encountered was a field that didn't really understand how to tell that story very well. So I'm going to try and tell that story with the framing of what has archaeology delivered to us and what does it tell us about how the story of Muwekma has not been told correctly. And I'm going to frame that also, and I'm going to juxtapose that with this very deep history of occupation of living on this land for 10,000 years at the very earliest, at the very least, it's that long. And I'll talk about why that's so important. Just for scale, for comparison, Ireland has only been settled for about 4,000 years. We don't think about Europe as a very recent, after the Ice Age occupation, and this area has a deep, deep history, and I'm going to talk about that. So frames, I'm going to go through a whole class in 10 minutes. I talk about these terminal narratives, the devices used by historians, archaeologists, anthropologists to explain the disappearance and the absence of Native people in this space. And what do they look like? They're all the same. Disease is one kind of agent that is used to explain the disappearance of Native people. That's not true. It's more about food systems that were taken away from Native people, collapsing the health of the population, making it impossible for people to survive off of bone broth and wheat that's collected in the missions. I'm sure that Lee has written about this pretty extensively. Military conquest, when people march into an area and they visit violence upon a group of people, the idea is that once that happens, Native people disappear. Not true. We stick around and we get angry, and we stick around and we stick around and we stick around. I always say that we're the longest disappearing group of people in the United States. We've been, any story about Native people will talk about our disappearance and our eventual demise. Missionization as well. Do the presence of missions extinguish the presence of Native people in the state? Take history classes, you'll find that we disappear soon after missions are invoked. The missions are only here for 64 years. Yunupero never spoke an indigenous language. So tell me if that's an accurate portrayal. And finally, acculturation, when people start to look like Charlene and they drive a car and they wear modern clothing, that they become invisible to us. And so those are the things that I was very interested in kind of undoing. And Lee has worked a great deal. That Narratives of Persistence book is the most comprehensive book about this area, California, the colonization of the Bay Area, that I've ever read. So where does this start? It starts with anthropology, the birthplace of bad ideas, and the birthplace of people who rescue bad ideas. It's the devil's workshop. And among the things that anthropologists invented was the concept of race and racial science. Another one is that the idea that Native people would soon be extinct all around the world. Ishi is the most famous example of this kind of a character, stand-in for the last savage, primitive Native person in North America, and Kroeber was his person. Kroeber took that mindset and used that idea of extinction to describe what he saw in California, and what he saw was people that he recognized as being too close to him to be of any value to anthropologists, and this is what he said. Few scattered individuals survive whose ancestors were once attached to the missions of San Jose, San Juan Bautista, San Carlos, but they are of mixed tribal ancestry and live lost. I don't think Charlene's lost, among other Indians or obscure Mexicans. So that clouding of descent, that clouding of the value of people is deliberate. And it spoke to the interests of the people at that time, but it doesn't do us very much good today. And if we think about the consequences of that bad scholarship, you can look at a map of California. And you'll see that about a third of the state, maybe 25% of the state, was supposed to be given to tribes. In the 1850s, the treaties, I'm sure we're going to talk about, there were treaty partners that were sent out from Washington, D.C. to settle, create reservations in California. And the whole state was divided up into these territory, these areas. Muwekma was not one of the groups that were contacted because the U.S. Army only connected to groups of people who were in active conflict with the United States military. So those are people who were experiencing colonization in the Central Valley and the Sierra Nevada mountains. So if you weren't part of a conflict, then you didn't get recorded, and that's part of the administrative errors that have led to problems for the tribe historically. I'm going to skip ahead here. This is a really important document for us. It's a photograph of a painting in Mission Dolores, and it's 1830. 1830 is when Native people are supposed to be all gone, and that's not happening. It didn't happen. And if you look at the photograph, you can't see it. You'll see priests in the background. You'll see Native people dancing. They're not on the way out. And dances like this were not the last gasp of a dying culture. It was a performance of power and strength and resiliency in front of these people. It was a way of saying, this is who we are. We're going to do our rituals. We're going to do our dances, honor our ancestors right in front of you, in front of the most sacred space that you can imagine. Food is a big part of this story. So when we think about the palette of experiences that Native people in the Bay Area were exposed to, we don't think about the beauty of the area in conjunction with the food and the kinds of wonderful flavors that are here. And that part of Muwekma's existence, the history of the tribe, should be celebrated. And there's a restaurant called Cafe Ohlone that does celebrate these foods. And one of the things that we value so much when we do cultural education is the centrality of food and the ecosystem as a place where we can reconnect. So I'm just going to highlight a few things about the deep history of the tribe and why I think you can make a compelling argument for a readjustment of our attitudes about Native people in the Bay. Most of the areas that would hold the earliest archaeological sites are underwater. The climate change was a phenomenon that was viewed, experienced, and lived by Native people. All of the origin stories for Muwekma Ohlone people start with the concept of change being constant. There's something always happening. There's always new introductions of new ideas, new plants, animals, beings, forces. And among those forces was climate change. The climate changed in real time for people in the Bay Area. Muwekma ancestors saw the Bay form and dissolve at least 5 times that we know about. They watched the sea levels rise. They saw things happen, and they weren't afraid of those things. This is part of our experience. Native people are not afraid of change or environmental change. Most of our ideas about where we come from are connected directly to the elements, and so we're not frightened of those things. So this is an amazing place. We had megafauna in the Bay Area. People don't know about that. People were here for a huge, long period of time, and the changes in making a living in material culture are reflected in the archaeological record. Archaeologists interpreted those changes rather than looking at continuity. They looked at those changes and uses of materials and tools and environment and foods to signal the presence of different immigrant groups of people. And that has affected the history of Muwekma and led to a very aggressive and very much needed assertion of presence in terms of DNA analysis between contemporary people and sites in the past. I'll just show you this. This just shows you how far out the sea level was in the time of the ancestors of people who live here. So out past the Farallon Islands was this river that went through all the way past the Golden Gate out into the ocean, and we think that it was probably a waterfall that would have rivaled Victoria Falls in Africa. Huge amounts of water. Think about the entire Sierra Nevada draining into this one river and then going out into the ocean. Muwekma people would have seen that happen. And then finally, think about the presence of Native people in the landscape for the last 10,000 years in this period of great climatic change. Native people didn't disappear from those things, and I want to emphasize that the changes brought by colonists were only one of many in the history of the tribe, and this is a much greater kind of challenge for people. All right, I don't have time to show you, but I want to talk about shell mounds all around the bay, about 450 of them. We're out of time. But this gives us a perfect record of the kind of social complexity. We use those words to describe the kind of interactions, economic, social, political, in the Bay Area that we're discovering now and through the research of people like Laura and Lee and other folks that, who work in the Bay Area. So we're trying to understand what this place looked like. Just to give you a sense, shell mounds are everywhere. They're everywhere. They're not just in Berkeley. And we're El Camino Real and I forget what's the cross street? San Antonio Boulevard has a large shell mound there. These were all over the place. They're still in the mountains. We see them occasionally using GPS and things. So a big part of the monumental architecture. I'm going to end with this, fire ecology, because I'm very interested in reintroducing these ideas for the use of the tribe in terms of rediscovering what we call traditional ecological knowledge. How do people manage this landscape for so long? It didn't just happen. There's genius, there's expertise and knowledge that allowed that to take place. So the plants and animals here and the human beings are co-adapted to this fire ecology landscape. So plants here have the ability to throw out little chemicals that keep other plants from growing around it, so that when fire goes through an area, fire that's introduced by human beings, it slows everything down. It doesn't create these catastrophic fires that we're seeing today. This is what the grasses look like that are introduced for cattle. I'm going to stop with this last quote because I think it leads to colonization in its most kind of potent and difficult forms. This one governor, one of the first governors of California, prohibits Native people from going into the fields and getting food, but also from doing cultural burns in this area. This is where it happened. And so he forbids this from happening. He doesn't understand the technology behind it, that that's necessary to feed people. And it's going to lead to, the absence of that foodstuffs is going to lead to massive health consequences for Native people. It's not diseases. Diseases are a function of the health of the individual and the community. We learned about this with COVID. And until we connect the idea of food systems and the kind of food that fed people and people's disconnection, forcible disconnection from those, we're never going to understand really what happened. So here's the quote. With attention to the widespread damage which results from the public from burning in the fields, customary up to now among both the Christian and Gentile Indians in this country whose childishness has been unduly tolerated. So they're upset about this work that people are doing to make the place function. 10,000 years. Don Jose Joaquin de Arriaga said, I see myself required to have the foresight to prohibit for the future, if it be necessary, of the rigors of the law, all kinds of burnings, not only in the vicinity of the towns right around here, but also in the most remote distances in the foothills we're going to talk about, to uproot this very harmful practice of setting fire to pasture land. So colonization brings these forces together. It's more complex than we're thinking about. And I wanted to give more of a history of the tribe, but I'm going to hope that you're going to cover the later stuff. But just want you to kind of recognize that the mission system is here for a short period of time. It collects all the data for people from this area, but it's not a perfect record. It's not a perfect record of anything. It's not a census. It's not 100% collecting of information. And if we really want to understand the history of this place and Muwekma's position in it, and Muwekma's struggle for not only getting land back, but also having a seat at the table in terms of tribal sovereignty, we have to give credit to and acknowledge and represent this deep history, this complex, deep history that provides us with the understanding of why it's so important to recognize this little blip that we're in of 250 years when colonists show up as a tiny part of the history of this community of people. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Panich. So these are all the slides. If you want a longer talk, just go on the web. I'm all over the place.